All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So it's time for the monthly oil production levels update for non-OPEC countries. The OPEC countries data is released separately in the middle of the month. And also, if you want to get a hold of the graphs used in this video or all kinds of other graphs across all kinds of different data, there's a link in the description to a Google Drive that I maintain with all kinds of different databases and everything. Any support helps the maintenance of that as well. Anyways, going down the list, Angola, former member of OPEC, who left as the group continues gradually falling apart. Link in the corner to a separate video about that if you want to hear about it. Angola peaked up at about 2 million barrels per day, and over the last decade and a half or 2 decades, they've declined down now to around 1 and are managing to hold off their decline here for a little bit. But obviously, they're not going to be able to keep that up forever. This time coming in at 1.07. Argentina, after having peaked and declined all the way down to 400, started fracking operations in the Vaca Muerta shale in the late 2010s, and that shale has brought them all the way up to now just about 800,000 barrels per day, which does have them as a net exporter again, as their usual domestic consumption levels are around 700. Australia, on the other hand, has lost the bit of boost that it got from the condensate production that accompanied all that new offshore gas production, and they've slipped back down from 400 into the 200s again, this time coming in at only 235,000 barrels per day. Azerbaijan, once up at 1.1 as their peak, has declined all the way down below 600,000 now, this time coming in at 581. Brazil, over 4 million barrels per day in terms of its actual capacity once everything is switched on properly. They had gotten up to 3.8 before, but they had to drop down towards 3.2 for a little bit because of extensive offshore maintenance on some of their larger fields. They have, over the first half of this year, however, been switching everything back on, and now they're back up over 3.8 at 3.81. And so within a couple months, they should be up at their full 4.2 capability. Canada was getting close to 5.2. However, with the massive wildfires going on in that region, they have had to shut down between 300 and 400,000 barrels per day, bringing them back down under 5 temporarily to 4.8. China managing to continue holding on by pushing offshore with the modest fields that they find in their waters. There's nothing really prolific out there, not like the Gulf of Mexico or offshore of Brazil, but they are still cleaning on a bit above 4, coming in at 4.34 million barrels per day. Colombia is beginning to look like it's hitting its next stair step decline, as it's been hanging out in the upper 700s for a few years, but now over the last year or so, it's begun making its way down from the 770s down through the 760s and into the 750s now, coming in at 756,000. Ecuador reached its all-time high at about 550, and they've effectively run to the limits of what territory they have to conduct exploration in. So this is the terminal decline for them, and they're down into the mid 400s now, or the upper portion of the mid 400s, now falling below 470 at 469,000 barrels per day. Egypt, after holding in the mid 500s for a while, has reached the next portion of their stair step decline and have been declining down towards pretty close to 500,000 flat now, this time coming in at 508. Meanwhile, their own domestic oil consumption is getting close to 900,000. Ghana had been declining down to around 150. Some enhanced recovery operations brought them back up to 188, from which they've declined now down to 186. And Guyana has added some minor expansions, some enhanced recovery projects, and brought themselves back up from 650 to 670 after having declined from around 680 previously down to 650. And in the second half of this year, their next field will be coming online, which will bring them up to about 900,000 barrels per day. India has stalled off their decline for the time being. They've been managing to hold around 600,000, while their own domestic oil consumption is now at about 6 million. And this time they came in at 607,000 barrels per day. Indonesia once held a decent plateau of around 1.5 for a few decades before hitting their terminal decline slope and slipping all the way down now to the upper 500s, coming in at 577,000 barrels per day. Kazakhstan continuing to push even further upwards after the various Tengiz oil field expansions and a few other expansion and enhanced recovery projects at some other minor locales. They have now exceeded 2.2 million barrels per day, coming in at 2.21. Mexico, after having declined down from their peak 2.5 decades ago, around 3.5, is continuing as expected to wobble or waffle around in the upper ones, where they're going to be hanging out for the remainder of most of the 2020s, as they do have a few new fields offshore that will give them bumps upward that they'll then resume declining from. And once we pass 2030, they're going to be going over the edge and continuing down further under 1.5. This time they came in at 1.71 million barrels per day. Malaysia continuing to hold itself off in the upper 400s for the moment, this time coming in at 485, and Norway bringing themselves back up over 2 million again to 2.03, and they would otherwise be at 2.2 because of that Castleberg field up in their Arctic waters. However, the activation of that was halted after some leakage was detected along a number of the pipelines, so it's going to take a month or two probably to get that worked out. Oman continuing to hold just under a million barrels per day, and they came in at 986,000 barrels per day. Qatar, another one who left OPEC because they were tired of following the whole regime, is continuing to hold around 1.3 million barrels per day. Russia, having gotten back up to almost 11 million barrels per day before invading Ukraine, losing their European customer base and having to abruptly cut production down to 10 million. And then, since the Western oil majors who rescued and maintained their production post Soviet collapse left in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, they haven't really been able to hold it all together and have been gradually slipping down, which they have filled in with excuses as to why they're having to supposedly deliberately draw down their production, when saying in one announcement that they're doing it to punish the West, in a different announcement saying that they're doing it in solidarity with OPEC as an act of friendship or something. And now, though, as they continue declining for the last year and a half, they've given up on providing actual reasons as to why it's happening, and instead have just insisted it's not happening, saying that their production has been staying at exactly 9 million barrels per day and not declining any further. But it has declined further down into the mid eights, and and over the course of May saw a bigger drop than previously, dropping from 8.72 down to now 8.6 million barrels per day. Senegal would otherwise not be included as their total numbers are below the 150 threshold that I set arbitrarily. However, the pressure gradients, the output capabilities of their first offshore field apparently turned out to be better than initially anticipated in the test drilling, as they have been able to up their production from the 100,000 they originally thought it would cap out at, up to now 127,000 for the last couple months. Thailand once held a plateau in the mid 200,000s for a decade and a half, but they've hit the end of that capability and declined down into the mid 100s, this time coming back up over the threshold again at 158. Turkmenistan continuing to stall themselves off a bit below 200 at 191,000 again. The UK, long fallen from its North Sea heights and not really having the expansive offshore territory like Norway does to work with any further. Not that the UK is really conducting oil and gas exploration, anyways. They have fallen all the way down from 3 million to the 600,000s now, coming in this time at 660,000 barrels per day. The US continuing to wobble and peak in the range I expected, the upper mid 13s, now falling down from that range, although it will get bumps back up there from some Gulf of Mexico fields over the next 2 years before the decline becomes too heavy to fight. But at the moment, it's down to 13.4, and might actually go down a bit faster soon because now that the oil prices are below shale's break even, shale making up the majority of US oil production now, the shale companies have been ceasing new drilling activities, which is why the active US oil rig drilling count you can see has started to abruptly nosedive. So for the moment, 13.4 million barrels per day from the US, and Vietnam once held a plateau in the 300,000s for about 2 decades, but they reached the end of that capability and they can't really do anything else offshore anymore because China keeps building artificial islands in the South China Sea and then declaring that everything within 200 miles of those islands in every direction belongs to China. So Vietnam is kind of geopolitically constrained. And this time they came in at 172,000 barrels per day. Meanwhile, their most recent domestic consumption levels are going up through the 600s and getting pretty close to 700,000 barrels per day. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. The link to the Google Drive is in the description that has all these graphs and graphs across all kinds of different data sets and subjects. There's links to my photography, to my blue sky, one in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.